For those who are interested in hearing this, this novel is set in Delhi, Kerala, and a bit of it in London, and it is not about the migrants' experience. You know, I have migrants' experience coming all over the place. This is not a migrant experience. This is actually a story based with a kernel of truth in it, because it's actually based on a real life incident. About in the 90s, mid-90s, I remember this very clearly because I was a reporter with Metropolitan Saturday in Bombay, and I heard this news that, you know, the ISRO is the Indian Space Research Organization, was the center of international aspiring, and there's a woman called Rashida who came in there from Mauritius and is leaking cryogenic engine secrets to the West through the architect of the project, who I know now pretty well now, and she was rather generous with her virtues, and there was a police inspector who wanted to get some sex out of her, and she, for no reason, she declined, and he was so cut up and rejected and angry. He put her in the jail, and then she was there for 4 years, and he fabricated a whole spy scam around this story. It was complete fabrication. For 10 years, these people had a miserable life. You know, this woman had to go back to her family. She couldn't do it. She didn't meet her daughter for 4 years. The other guy's life was ruined. His wife went mad. And I realized that, you know, Indians are into fabrication. Basically, we are into something in our head which has no real connection with the outside world, but it takes over you. So this story is actually based on that, but I've completely fictionalized, and I am narrating it primarily from the point of view of the very corrupt and very prurient police officer. Tears for the Crying Squad, and this is excerpts from the first chapter. The title of the chapter is A Facilitator of Fatalities. When first light flared and the abattoirs of Delhi, old Delhi, came alive with the dying of animals, Hani Bhimrao Jasprit Kumar wakened to a phone call that broke his recurring Monday nightmare, in which, as a boy of 12, he ran endlessly by a black lake because he no longer knew how to stop. In the dream, he had traded his ability to control his limbs so he could save his mother's life. As this did not happen, and he was informed she could not survive the accident, he had opened his eyes in protest, but had continued to run breathlessly in his head. Such violence in our dreams, he thought, sitting up. The Hanikumar is the police officer. The caller said Hanikumar should think twice before taking his mother to a doctor. Over the years, Hanikumar had developed an acute sense for the sulfides of decay, and he could tell from the smell and sound of the words that the man at the other end was rotting. Hanikumar rubbed the triangular patch of his forehead, a tiny clearing at the center of a teeming forest of curls, with the back of his fist. He was all right with rot. Corruption was a natural state of the people he normally came across, but he had exercised caution in the prospective act of sharing the spoils, the fraught, violent process of profit distribution that forged human fate. My mother died years ago. Who are you? Though it was end of March, it had been unusually extended winter, and the woolens had not disappeared into trunks. Still, Hanikumar's face streamed with sweat from the dream. Dreams are real, he thought. Why else was his heart pounding at the mere hologram of a few mismatched memories? I am a whistleblower. The voice at the other end was bitter, as if a fateful meeting had gone wrong the night before. A facilitator of fatalities, you might call me. Imagine your mother and sister being examined by doctors who can't tell tongue from tympanum. Can you imagine that, officer? Hanikumar shook his head, and the million black springs on his head unwound a little, like an alarm going off. Often he had thought of his head as the face of a clock, his long nose the hub, his hooded eyes 10 and 2, his thick lips fallen low at 6, his tongue the cuckoo bird. He noted that the whistleblower did not mention father and brother as characters in the unfolding medical tragedy. Perhaps pathos was direr if exemplified by women. Please be clear, Hanikumar was fully awake now, ready to use up the day and wade into the mud. It is the anesthesiology exam today. At least 6 students at the medical institute will be clearing it through high-tech copying. The voice paused to underline the word high-tech. Hanikumar imagined he could hear the man run the tip of his tongue over his lips, thinking. He was fascinated by mouths. He knew he stared at mouths when people spoke, the way the lips moved in amoebic frenzy, keeping pace with the tongue. Very high-tech. These are the craftsmen of our long night. Imagine them administering anesthesia. Picture your mother waking to a knife in her bones on the operation table. That's pain. Why are you calling now? Did pain come from ignorance? Possible. The sources of pain were many. Thoughts, objects, mothers, babies who defenestrated themselves from 6th floor windows while parents bickered over coffee. Hanikumar's eyes came to light. Incredibly, the gossamer world was visible yet again like a trick of light. He coughed. The objects in the room shook. He reached for the cough syrup on the side table, drowned a mouthful. He opened and closed his eyes, willing things to go and come back, so all was real. The near wall, lined with leather-bound books, most of which he had opened only once to put down his signature and date, a meticulous exercise in acknowledging himself at the expense of well-known authors. Above the window was a fine framed reprint of Van Gogh's almond blossoms, electric with the temporary insanity of life. And right next door hung the gleaming old-fashioned wall clock, with its elusive 11 o'clock chimes. He had moved into his new apartment only a month ago in the quiet and verdant Jorbagh area of Delhi. I'm going to skip a couple of paragraphs and go into the meat of the story. Give me the details, Hanikumar said to the whistleblower. Most likely, the whistleblower, a doctor himself, had been done out of a deal. People who clamored for truth almost always were those who had failed to be a part of the lie. Hanikumar jotted down the exact location of the exam hall and the ticket numbers of the suspect students and then drew a firm line under it, putting 2 dots below. He always put 2 dots to indicate conclusion. It was only later he realized that when he was doing one thing, he was actually doing another. Life worked its tricks simultaneously on at least 2 fluid fronts. You drew a line and you thought it vertical. Then someone came along and held the paper the other way and the line turned horizontal. In time, he would think dimensions changed. In a slow tone that barely suppressed his agitation, the whistleblower explained that how the students operated. The invigilator had been bought off. The students strapped cell phones to their wrists under their sleeves. They photographed the question papers and sent them to their helpers, 3 fellow students and the medical college dean, in a cramped room in Daryaganj in Old Delhi. It would be Old Delhi, wouldn't it? The caller said, as if his perennial source of personal grief was Old Delhi, the phantasmal forted capital of the Mughals, where a decrepit, disinherited king in grey beard and long fraying white muslin gown still might be caught peeping out of a blown-out window of one of the old Havelis, a one-dimensional form with maybe one glittering eye and a dark hole for a mouth, emerging uncertainly from the hollows of time, the rest of his features erased by the fierce moonlight. While outside, against the curtain of blue night, the palaces, mosques and moats rose like shadows of history, and you couldn't walk past Red Fort, from where ruled the foolish and tragic Bahadur Shah Zafar, the only emperor in history destined to lead a revolt inspired, I might add, as a student of history, by cows and pigs, the grease of which mythical animals loosened the nuts and bolts of the blasphemous East India Company and led to its dissolution in 1858. I am referring to the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, of course, and I suggest it is a matter of serious concern that over a century and a half later, the 2 beasts are still yoked to the fate of this mutinous nation, with rearing the best. See, what's happening now is that this guy who is calling up on the phone and talking to this man is moving into a whole lot of things. So what he is trying to say is that Old Delhi is the capital of corruption, and that he should actually listen to him carefully and expose the corruption which is happening in the medical institute. Now what happens is that this police officer goes to the medical institute, sees the corruption happening, and instead of arresting it, what he does is to go right back into the dean's room. He breaks open that door and gets money from him. So that's the first chapter story. I'm just coming to that. He pulled on his trousers and got his jeep out. From near a window, Hanikumar watched the proceedings in the exam hall with an appreciative eye. The All India Institute of Medical Sciences in South Delhi was a sprawling complex of squat concrete structures, exhaling odors of decay and mend. The institute trained and employed some of the best doctors in the world, quite a few of whom eventually ended up super specializing in the body behaviors of just one patient, a minister, a tycoon, a wealthy father-in-law. The anesthesia department was in the far back on the 4th floor. A broad veranda ran by the exam hall, thick pillars strewn through shadows on the cracked floor. In the distance, an ambulance suddenly cut its way, perhaps unable to find a way ahead of the milling traffic. A full-bodied nurse went past Hanikumar with military precision in her gait, and the click of her shoes on the floor struck him as exaggerated and invitational. He stared after the parade and was momentarily distracted by the festive mysteries of the female form. He planted his gaze back in the hall with his 23 students. At least 5 of them he could see were making minute movements with their hands, unwarranted in answering a question paper. A good fraud approximated art. Like a painting, a whole industry grew around it. It created its own world with its own priorities and values. Actual people inhabited it, and there was no way to know it was less real than the one it supplanted or extended. Across the quadrangle, a black cat chased a squirrel up a tree in a silent movie of life and death. The cat crouched, claws out, muzzles taut, tail swishing, looking up at the tree for justice. Hanikumar withdrew from the sanitized surroundings that smelled of detergent and medicines and for some reason oranges that were slightly off, and drove fast to 11 Daryaganj near Jama Masjid, past a chaotic main road, one side of which was dug up. Owing to a storm in the night, Delhi froze if the mountains up north gathered snow. The morning was like a sepia photograph. Wet cars, glistening lights and shrouded people. The odd dog and the elephantine bull appeared embalmed in brown ether. Beneath their skin, blood flowed. Hanikumar thought, in rain so perfect not even the Dutch could engineer that. Hanikumar parked the jeep on the wrong side of the lane of tall houses with tiny windows and carved doors and entered the portals of one that looked deserted. He went up a flight of wooden stairs that creaked and groaned with his remembered passages, a fading memory echoing with footfalls and arrivals and departures of thieves, soldiers and psychopaths. Dust laid a downy coating on the wooden rails. On the second landing, he kicked down a blue door. His big form filled the frame. Police, and you freeze, you bandchoots. He roared after a strategic clearing of his throat, his revolver out and sweeping the air before him in an arc of caution. Anything could happen in this democracy of, for and by sister fuckers, this brotherhood of bandchoots. He was ready for extreme violence or abject appeasement. He could see and hear himself changing every which way like a man made of mercury, fully equipped for the emergencies of the moment, and his head grew antennae, his face multiple eyes, his nostrils flared. Hanikumar scoped the room that turned medicine into murder. I'll stop here.